The shadow does not die with the body. It waits, not to punish, but to be seen. They say the most terrifying moment after death is not the judgment from above. It's the judgment from within. The moment you come face to face with the parts of you never dared to meet in life. The sadness you buried, the anger you silenced, the younger version of you who stood in the corner, still waiting to be chosen. In the final days of his life, Carl Jung scribbled thoughts that were never meant for the public, not because they weren't true, but because the world wasn't ready. Among his last notes was a single question: what happens to the shadow after death? To Jung, death wasn't an ending, it was a crossing, and the shadow, the unconscious self, does not vanish when the heart stops beating. Instead, it follows the soul, waiting until the soul turns around to face what it ran from in life. Tonight, you and I will enter that quiet place together, not with fear, but with clarity, to understand what it truly means to meet the shadow. Not just before we die, but after. But before we talk about what awaits on the other side, we must return to the beginning of that mystery. A letter never sent, a confession Jung may have written if he had just one more night by candlelight. Let us begin there, in the silence of a man who saw beyond the veil and chose to leave behind a map. For those brave enough to read it, the room was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a candle burning down to its final inch. Outside, the snow had started to fall over Lake Zurich, and the wind carried the silence of a man preparing to leave this world. Carl Jung, now in his 80s, sat at his desk with trembling hands. In front of him was a sheet of heavy parchment, unlabeled, unsent, a letter, not addressed to a person, but to something deeper, to the soul, to the future. He had spent his life decoding dreams, chasing archetypes, confronting the shadow. But in these final hours, he wasn't writing as a doctor or a thinker. He was writing as a soul preparing to cross over. The ink spilled in uneven strokes. His words were not polished. They were raw, urgent, like someone speaking from a fire that had been burning inside for decades. The shadow is not a metaphor. It is a psychic reality, and it does not disappear when the body ceases. It waits at the threshold, not to condemn, but to complete what life left unfinished. This wasn't a theory. This was a truth Jung had seen again and again in patients, in dreams, in the unexplainable moments between sleep and death. He recalled one patient, a woman in her 70s, who'd been haunted by the same dream for years. In it, she stood before a dark mirror. Behind her, a little girl wept softly. She always woke before turning around. Jung believed this was her shadow, her childhood grief, never faced, never held. And he feared that, in death, that mirror would no longer be symbolic. It would be real. She would have to turn, because death does not erase what we avoid. It amplifies it. In his letter, he warned, we carry our unloved parts with us into death. Our anger, our guilt, our self-betrayals. If they are not faced in life, they become the gatekeepers in death. And yet, there was no condemnation in his tone, only compassion. He believed the soul did not go to heaven or hell by judgment, but by vibration, and the shadow unintegrated lowers that vibration. It pulls the soul back to what is unfinished, unloved, unseen. The letter closed with this: there is no greater preparation for death than the integration of the shadow. Not because death is to be feared, but because what we do not meet in life, we are destined to meet in silence. Then the candle flickered, and the ink dried. The letter was folded and placed between pages of an old red notebook. It was never mailed, never signed. But perhaps, in some way, it was meant for you, because if Jung was right, that the shadow does not end with death, then we must ask the question no one wants to ask. What, exactly, is it that your shadow will carry across the veil? We like to imagine that death resets everything, that when the heart stops, our pain dissolves, our mistakes are forgiven, and the soul floats into light. But what if that isn't the case? Carl Jung believed the unconscious does not die with the body. He called it the psychoid realm, a layer of reality where the psyche and matter overlap. And in this realm, the shadow follows us, like a silent passenger. What is the shadow? Really, it is everything in you that you could not or would not accept. The grief you pushed down, the rage you silenced behind a smile, the shame you carried in your bones but never named. When we die, we do not leave those parts behind. We take them with us, because the soul is not a suitcase we pack for heaven. It's a field of energy, magnetic, resonant, honest. Jung once wrote that the shadow is 90% pure gold. He did not mean it was beautiful. He meant it was valuable, because it holds what is real. And the afterlife, by nature, responds only to what is real. There are countless stories from people who've had near-death experiences, not of meeting angels, but of meeting themselves in a mirror, in a replay, in a flood of memories they couldn't control. One man described being surrounded by his own thoughts, not as ideas, but as living forms. His regrets had shape, his lies had weight. He didn't see fire, he saw truth. The soul, Jung believed, cannot transcend unless it has integrated the unresolved parts. In other words, death doesn't purify us, it reveals us. The shadow becomes the gatekeeper. It decides where we go next, not in punishment, but by law of attraction. If your soul is full of things you've never faced, you may be drawn back into another body, another life, another lesson, not because you were bad, but because something remains incomplete. The shadow holds the echo of every time you stayed silent when you wanted to speak, every time you abandoned yourself to be accepted, every time you chose comfort over truth. It remembers, and not to haunt you, but to ask you, will you face this now? Or will you carry it into the next chapter? That is why the afterlife is not a blank slate. It is the most honest reflection you will ever see, not of how others saw you, but of who you really were. And if we follow Jung's logic, there is one unavoidable conclusion. You cannot escape your shadow by dying. You can only escape it by turning toward it, in life or in the stillness after. But if the shadow does follow us beyond the grave, then the question becomes even more haunting. Where exactly do we meet it? And what happens when the soul crosses the threshold? There is a moment after death that few can describe, not because it is empty, but because it is overwhelmingly precise. Carl Jung believed that when the body falls away, consciousness does not end. It passes through what he called the threshold realm, a liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully beyond, where the soul meets the truth it spent a lifetime avoiding. And in that place, the first thing the soul encounters is a mirror, not made of glass, but of memory, emotion, energy. This mirror does not reflect your face. It reflects your unfinished self, the parts of you you silenced, the emotions you numbed, the choices you regret but never admitted. This is where the shadow waits, not as a monster, not as a judge, but as a shape made from every unlived truth. Jung suggested that the psyche survives death in a symbolic state, and that symbolism becomes more vivid, more unforgiving, when there is no longer a body to buffer it. In life, we distract ourselves. In death, there is nothing left to distract with. One patient once described a dream where she walked through a foggy forest, only to arrive at a lake so still it looked like glass. When she bent to look into the water, she didn't see her reflection. She saw a little girl, cold, bruised, and waiting. The girl looked up and whispered, "Why didn't you come for me?" This, Jung would say, is the threshold encounter, not with God, not with judgment, but with the you that was left behind. In spiritual traditions across cultures, this same image appears. the weighing of the heart in Egyptian belief, the bardo in Tibetan Buddhism, where the soul meets projections of its own mind, the panoramic life review in near-death experiences, where you feel everything you made others feel, in Jungian language. This is the confrontation with the shadow in its purest form. And this is where most souls get stuck, not because they're unwilling, but because they're unprepared. If you spent your life avoiding grief, you'll meet it here. If you refuse to forgive yourself, you'll stand before that moment again, this time with no ego to shield you. And yet, this is not hell. This is the gate of transformation. Jung believed the soul could not evolve, could not move on, until it integrated the opposites, until light and dark became one. So what happens in this mirror realm is not punishment. It is invitation, an invitation to finally see, finally hold, finally love the version of you that was never allowed to exist. There is no priest, no verdict, just you and the shadow of who you could have been. But here's the secret Jung left between the lines. The shadow doesn't want to hurt you. It wants something far deeper, and in the next chapter, we'll uncover what that is. We've been taught to fear the shadow, as if it's a dark force waiting to drag us down. But Jung saw something else. He saw that the shadow, beneath all its raw emotion and terrifying intensity, doesn't want revenge. It doesn't want to punish, destroy, or even dominate. It simply wants to be seen, to be held in the light of consciousness. Because what was once repressed, what was cast away in shame, can only be healed through one thing, witnessing. And in the realm beyond death, there is nowhere left to run, no roles to play, no masks to wear, no more pretending to be fine. What's left is the truth you never said out loud. Jung wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. But when the body dies, the substitution ends, the original pain returns, and it wants you to finally sit with it without turning away. Imagine standing before your unloved self, the version of you who wasn't strong, beautiful, kind, or successful, the one who failed, the one who begged, the one who broke down in the dark and begged God to explain the pain. That self is your shadow, not evil, just exiled. It carries your most intimate truths, the betrayal you still haven't forgiven, the guilt over your children, the choices you still wake up thinking about at 3 a.m., the voice inside you that always whispered, "You are not enough." Now, imagine that voice doesn't scream at you after death. It whispers. It says, "I only wanted you to notice me." You see, the shadow doesn't need you to agree with it. It doesn't even need you to fix it. It just needs to be acknowledged as real, as part of you, as worthy of being seen. That moment of witnessing, that's the alchemy. That's what begins to loosen the chains between lives. Without that recognition, many souls return into new bodies, new lives, haunted by old wounds they don't remember, but feel every day. But when the soul finally turns toward the shadow, when it says, "I see you," the energy shifts. The pain no longer repeats. The cycle no longer binds. The darkness no longer threatens, because it's no longer hidden. Jung believed that even the darkest parts of us carry sacred energy, and that by witnessing the shadow after death, we begin to reclaim the soul's full power. And yet for many women, there is a special kind of shadow that remains hidden the longest, not because it is violent or angry, but because it is invisible in its sacrifice. In the next chapter, we explore the feminine shadow and why so many women carry it into death, unseen, unheard, and deeply unresolved. Not all shadows look like rage or addiction. Some wear aprons, some speak softly, some tuck themselves into silence so well you'd never know they existed. Carl Jung believed that women carry a unique kind of shadow, not because their pain is lesser, but because it's often socially celebrated while spiritually suppressed. For many women, especially in midlife and beyond. The shadow doesn't appear as something wild or uncontrollable. It appears as a lifetime of emotional labor, unspoken grief, and hidden resentment. It appears in the space between what was given and what was never received. She raised the children. She kept the family from falling apart. She swallowed her voice so others could be heard. She showed up every day without complaint, and somewhere along the way, she disappeared. This, Jung would say, is the bright shadow, a darkness created not from cruelty, but from over-identifying with goodness. Society rewards women who are selfless, patient, nurturing, but it often punishes those who say no, who express anger, who set boundaries. So what happens? A woman divides herself in two. The acceptable version goes into the light, the smiling, giving, calm version. The rest goes underground. And in the afterlife, that underground self comes forward, not to shame, not to blame, but to ask the one question that was never spoken. When did you stop choosing yourself? Jung warned that what is repressed in the unconscious does not remain quiet forever. In life, it becomes depression, anxiety, illness. In death, it becomes the echo that delays the soul's release. Many women who die in their 60s, 70s, or 80s still carry the voice of a 7-year-old girl inside. A girl who was told to be good, to not upset daddy, to smile when touched, to stay quiet when hurt. That girl never grew up. She became part of the shadow. And when the soul leaves the body, she doesn't vanish. She steps forward. She may appear in a dream, as a child with bruised knees, or a woman in black, watching from the edge of a field, or as a memory you forgot you had, a moment when you said yes, but everything inside you screamed no. The feminine shadow is not a villain. She is the voice that was never allowed to speak. She says, I wanted to dance. I wanted to rest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to be held. And I needed you to choose me. But you kept choosing everyone else. And in the threshold after death, this voice is no longer background noise. It is center stage. But here is the grace Jung left us. If you can witness her, if you can hold her hand in the dark, if you can say, I see you, I remember you, I forgive us both, then she doesn't have to follow you anymore. She can finally rest. And so can you. But if the shadow remains unspoken, if the soul dies with that voice still buried, what happens next? Carl Jung and Edgar Cayce both pointed to the same mysterious truth. Reincarnation doesn't begin with desire. It begins with unfinished business. And in the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when the shadow still has something to say, and the soul must return. To finish the conversation, what brings a soul back? It's rarely longing, rarely curiosity, and almost never choice. Carl Jung believed that the psyche is self-regulating, that what is unresolved seeks completion, just as wounds seek healing. And so, when the shadow remains unintegrated at the moment of death, it calls the soul back, not as punishment, not as karma in the way we often romanticize, but as a magnetic pull toward what was left undone. Imagine it like this. Your life is a circle, but you only complete half. The other half, the pain you avoided, the truths you never spoke, the love you never allowed. It doesn't vanish. It waits. And after death, when the soul begins to rise, it senses the weight of that incompletion. And that weight bends the arc of your journey back to earth. Not necessarily to the same story, but to the same pattern, because what you do not face becomes your fate. Jung never stated reincarnation as doctrine, but he observed it in dreams, in patience, in archetypes that surfaced across generations. He wrote, I could well imagine that I might have lived in former centuries and there encountered questions I was not yet able to answer, that I had to be born again because I had not fulfilled the task given to me. Edgar Cayce, who echoed Jung in many ways, said something similar. The soul returns not for reward, but for realization. It's not about being a better person. It's about becoming a whole person. Let's say you lived your entire life hiding your voice, afraid to speak up, terrified of being rejected or misunderstood. At death, that fear doesn't resolve. It becomes a thread, woven into the soul's energetic field. And so you return, perhaps this time in a body that must speak to survive, or in circumstances that force you to confront abandonment until the shadow is seen, until the silence is broken. Each lifetime becomes a mirror, a reenactment of a lesson unlearned, and the shadow, though invisible, becomes the author of the script. This is why some people feel haunted by patterns they don't understand, falling into the same toxic relationships, feeling shame that doesn't match their life story, carrying grief for something they've never consciously lost. It's not imagination. It's inheritance from the self to the self, across lifetimes. But there is another path, integration, to turn toward the shadow now, to meet the grief before it becomes fate, to listen to the inner voice before it becomes an outer circumstance. Because what is faced in this life does not have to be repeated in the next. Your unspoken story doesn't need to become your child's struggle. Your silence doesn't need to echo into another identity. You are the only one who can interrupt the cycle. Jung believed that the greatest task of life was not perfection, but wholeness, and that if we complete the circle in this lifetime, if we reclaim the lost, the broken, the buried, we can move on, truly move on, not into escape, but into evolution. But the shadow doesn't just show up after death or in the next life. It speaks now, in dreams, in symbols, in moments of deep emotion we don't understand. And if we listen carefully, we might hear what it's trying to tell us. In the next chapter, we'll enter the mysterious realm where the shadow communicates from beyond, through the dreamscape and the invisible language of the soul. After the body is gone, the soul does not simply vanish. It lingers, listens, and sometimes whispers. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious mind doesn't shut down at death. It simply changes form. And one of the ways it continues to speak before and after death is through dreams, symbols, and synchronicities. Not all messages from the beyond come with flashing lights or angelic choirs. Some arrive quietly, in the middle of the night, as a vivid image you can't shake, or a dream that stays with you long after waking, or a phrase, a smell, a memory that returns at just the right moment. When the veil between worlds grows thin, Jung called this the psychoid realm, a place between matter and spirit, where the psyche and the soul overlap. And within this realm, symbols are not just metaphors, they are living forces. Let's talk about dreams. In the Jungian tradition, dreams are never random. They are the language of the unconscious, and often the voice of the shadow. But after death, those dreams shift. They no longer just come from within your mind. They come from the field of the soul. How many people have dreamed of a deceased parent, sitting silently in a chair, holding out a photo, or standing beside a child who's still living? How many have seen strange figures in dreamscapes, women in black, doors that won't open, rooms they've never entered before? Jung would say, these are not just dreams. They are encounters with the shadow, with unresolved energy, with the self or the soul of another, still seeking peace. One woman described dreaming of a young girl crying in a bathtub. She had no children. She had never seen the girl before, but in the dream, she knew this was a part of her she had lost. For weeks, the dream returned. Same scene, same sorrow. She brought it to her Jungian therapist, who asked a simple question: what did you stop feeling in childhood? Suddenly, the dream made sense. The girl wasn't someone else. She was the part of herself she left behind, when she learned that being quiet meant being safe. This is how the shadow speaks, not with words, but with images, images that bypass the mind and go straight to the soul. Even in death, the shadow doesn't scream. It shows you a place you've forgotten, a face you still carry, a wound you didn't know you were born with. And sometimes, the shadow doesn't come from within you, but from someone who has already crossed. Edgar Cayce once said, "The dead speak to the living when the living are ready to listen." A mother who never spoke her truth in life may send a dream to her daughter, a warning, a plea, a release. A father who never said, "I'm sorry," may appear in a vision, handing you the watch he never took off. A symbol of time, of forgiveness, of things left unsaid. These are not just signs. They are bridges between the seen and unseen, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the living and the departed. Jung believed that if we pay attention to these messages, we can begin to complete what death interrupted, that we can respond, not just with emotion, but with action, to say the words that were never said, to honor the part of us that still grieves, to live in a way that gives voice to what once remained silent. And that brings us to the most important truth of all. If the shadow travels with us, if it calls to us in dreams, if it waits for us at death, then there is only one way to be free. We must face it now, not after we die, not in another lifetime, but here, while we still have the breath to speak and the courage to turn toward what we once ran from. We spend so much of our lives trying to be good mothers, good daughters, good wives, good citizens. But in the quiet hours when the performance fades, something else speaks, something beneath the goodness, something older than the roles we've played. That voice is the shadow, and it will not be silenced by death. Carl Jung believed that the true purpose of life wasn't perfection, but integration, to bring all parts of the self, light and dark, strong and fragile, into one whole. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So what happens when we do make it conscious? When we dare to sit with our shame, our anger, our unloved parts, we begin to break the cycle. We stop handing the shadow to our children. We stop projecting it onto partners and strangers. And most importantly, we stop dragging it into the afterlife. Integration is not about reliving trauma. It's about reclaiming what was lost. It starts small. A moment of truth whispered in a journal. A conversation long avoided, now finally spoken. A letter written to your younger self, not to fix her, but to finally hear her. Integration asks, where have I betrayed myself to belong? What truth have I buried so deeply? I've convinced myself it never existed. Who inside me is still waiting to be seen? And then, with gentleness, you go there. You sit beside the shadow like you would sit beside a grieving child, not to change it, but to say, I'm still here. I never stopped loving you. I'm ready now. This is the work, and it is sacred, because when you do this in life, you don't have to face it again in death. You cross the threshold without weight, without fear, without the echo of unfinished parts pulling you back. And in that moment, the shadow becomes something else. It becomes light, the same way compost becomes soil, the same way a scar becomes proof that you survived. The integrated shadow is not a burden. It is your strength. It is your wisdom. It is your liberation. Closing thought. Carl Jung never claimed to know exactly what happens after death, but he gave us a map, not of the heavens, but of the soul. And on that map, there is one message that echoes across every dream, every archetype, every whispered truth. Do not wait until death to meet yourself, because the real afterlife, the one that matters most, begins now. If this message stirred something inside you, don't let it fade. Sit with it. Write to your shadow. Light a candle for the part of you that was never given a name. And if this video helped bring you closer to your truth, type "I see you" in the comments. Let your shadow know you are no longer hiding. Subscribe for more journeys into the deep soul work of Jung, Kaise, and the sacred mystery within us all. You are not alone. You never were.